39 years ago, a young female student named Elysia vanished on her way home from campus, leaving behind no trace except her bicycle neatly placed in the middle of a peaceful neighborhood street. Authorities suspected a man wearing a hooded jacket who had been seen near the scene was involved, but with no body, no clear witnesses, and every lead eventually going cold, the case stalled completely. Yet throughout the years that followed, Elysia's family never gave up hope, clinging to the belief that the truth was still hidden somewhere among the dust-covered fragments of evidence. Then one day, when investigators reopened the cold case file, a detail overlooked for nearly 4 decades suddenly emerged, triggering a chain of revelations powerful enough to overturn every prior assumption and shock the entire Kalamazoo community. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to keep following along with us. One early autumn evening in Kalamazoo, the cold air swept through the quiet streets like an invisible thin mist, slipping into the gaps between the old brick houses and pushing dry, golden leaves along the edges of the sidewalks. The smell of damp earth from the front lawns mixed with the chill, making the atmosphere thick and still in a way that forced passers-by to notice every small sound. Elysia, 20 years old, left the Western Michigan University campus after a late class, clutching her stack of books to her chest as she started down the familiar route to the boarding house where she lived. The glow of the campus lights behind her faded, swallowed by the darkness of the residential area, while the road ahead was lit only by sparse sodium street lamps, each one carving out a small pool of light before quickly abandoning the surrounding space to shadow. Her habit of walking this route meant Elysia didn't pay much attention to the strange silence enveloping the Winchell neighborhood. Yet that unusual atmosphere still crept into every breath she took. The houses receded farther back, leaving only the rows of trees lining both sides of the road rustling in the wind enough to obscure any small movements behind or in the dark gaps between the trunks. One witness recounted that while passing a nearby intersection, he saw Elysia stop to talk with a tall man wearing a hooded jacket, his figure slightly tilted as if trying to keep his face out of the streetlight's glow. In the dim light, the witness could only make out the build and gestures, unable to hear any words of the exchange. What caught his attention was how Elysia gripped her books more tightly than usual and stepped back slightly. Not enough to call it fear, but enough to show a mild tension, as if she were trying to maintain distance without making a scene or drawing attention. A light gust flipped the edge of her jacket, accompanied by a faint rustling sound, and in the very moment they parted, the hooded man's figure melted into the darkness behind him, while Elysia continued walking into a stretch of road with even less light than usual. That was the last moment anyone saw her. The long, empty stretch of road saw little traffic at night, and most of the windows in the houses along it were already dark, with only a few lights spilling from TVs or bedside lamps of those still awake. After Elysia disappeared from view, no unusual sounds broke the silence. No screams, no running footsteps, no sounds of struggle. No one in the nearby houses noticed anything out of the ordinary. A sense of emptiness seemed to settle over the space, swallowing every sign of movement. Time passed, and in Elysia's boarding room the desk lamp remained on. The light jacket she planned to wear the next day still hung neatly behind the door, her spare pair of shoes sitting undisturbed under the bed. Her roommate returned and noticed the unusually prolonged silence, calling Elysia's name several times but receiving only emptiness in reply. As the night wore on, worry mounted when none of her close friends knew where she was. The landline rang endlessly as the roommate called everyone who might have information, but every answer was the same. No one had seen her since she left campus. When her family received the call that Elysia hadn't returned to her room, unease turned into real fear. They called back repeatedly, hoping the next ring would bring Elysia's voice with an explanation, but only the cold sound of ringing echoed through the house. They didn't hesitate another moment, and decided to call the police right away. When the call reporting that Elysia had not returned to her boarding room was transferred to dispatch, Kalamazoo police immediately mobilized units that very night to check the areas she normally traveled through. The district headquarters activated the emergency missing person protocol, and a dedicated investigative team was assembled right away in the parking lot behind the station, where the harsh light from high-pressure sodium lamps spilled onto the damp ground, casting cold, glaring halos. The atmosphere was heavy but decisive. Officers quickly divided up zones and launched the sweep plan. Topographic maps were spread out on the hood of a patrol car, clearly marking the boundaries of the Winchell neighborhood, the stretch of Stadium Drive, and the path leading into Milham Woods. These were all areas Elysia habitually passed through in the evening, spaces with deep pockets of darkness, sparse population, minimal activity, and few observers late at night. The search teams carried high-powered flashlights, splitting into small groups to sweep the side streets. Beams flashed repeatedly across bushes, sidewalks, and the gaps between parked cars along the curb, probing for anything out of place or items that might have been dropped. Night dew clung to their jackets, and the wind blowing out from Milham Woods made the air even sharper, heightening the desolate feel of the area under scrutiny. At the intersection where the witness said he had seen Elysia talking to a man in a hooded jacket, investigators asked him to pinpoint exactly where he had been standing and the direction from which he observed them. The witness stepped under the flickering street lamp and pointed to the patch of ground where he had watched. He described the man's relative height, the way he held his shoulders, and the lack of cooperative body language. When pressed further about the man's actions, he hesitated, then lowered his voice and admitted a detail he hadn't dared confirm earlier. The man hadn't just stood talking, he had also stepped sideways enough to partially block Elysia's path. The witness described the gesture as not aggressive but intentional, like a move designed to control the space and gain the upper hand in the situation. Investigators asked the witness to reenact the direction Elysia continued walking and to identify his line of sight when the two parted. Elysia had turned her face toward Winchell as if intending to keep going, while the hooded man stepped back one pace enough to slip out of the streetlight's glow and melt into the darkness right behind him. That was as far as the witness saw. He then hurried on home and didn't look back again. All this information was carefully recorded in the scene log. The investigative team built an interactive model based on heights, angles of stance, and the lighting layout at the encounter spot. The model showed that the light was so weak it produced only silhouettes, making facial identification nearly impossible. Nevertheless, the man's blocking maneuver and Elysia's response stood out clearly in the simulation. Her slight retreat and the way she gripped her books tighter caught the investigators' attention, as it revealed an instinctive self-protective reaction in an unsafe situation. Another group of investigators expanded the search in a semicircular radius, starting from the witness's encounter point and extending toward Milham Woods. On the ground, the layer of dry leaves and dirt showed slight disturbance in a few spots, but nothing distinct enough to confirm a specific direction of travel. These vague signs were photographed and flagged for possible correlation with findings elsewhere. Another team checked lesser-known side paths, including narrow trails cutting through thickets or connecting to modest parking lots tucked behind residential areas. These routes were typically unlit and provided ideal conditions for an abduction to occur undetected. When compiled, the scene map revealed a striking number of blind spots within a tight radius. This made reconstructing Elysia's exact path extremely difficult, but it also pointed to the possibility that the hooded man had deliberately chosen the location for its vulnerabilities. The analysis team constructed a preliminary timeline from what could be verified. The moment the witness saw Elysia, the time her roommate began to worry, the time her family received the call, and the window during which Elysia most likely vanished between unobserved stretches of road. Though incomplete, the investigators realized the missing segment fell precisely along the darkest and quietest portion of the route, the very stretch where the hooded man had appeared. Cross-referencing the light map, local traffic flow data, and statements from the area, the team began forming an initial assessment. There were no signs of voluntary departure, no recorded personal conflicts, no indications of mental instability or plans to change her living situation. The scene evidence and interactive model showed the man's approach was purposeful and controlling. These scattered pieces, when placed together, formed a hazy but compelling picture of external intervention. Investigators weighed every possibility, tested the logic of each fact, and step by step arrived at a clear conclusion. Elysia's disappearance bore the hallmarks of a deliberate abduction, carried out by someone familiar with the terrain, aware of the area's weaknesses, and calm enough to approach the victim without drawing attention. The investigative team continued to expand the sweep radius, by reconstructing the entire possible route Elysia may have taken during the window of her disappearance. With no official timestamps beyond the witness account and Elysia's usual travel habits, reconstructing the journey required cross-referencing every small detail, from the distance between light poles to the layout of each road segment. They calculated Elysia's average walking speed based on the routes she typically took, then determined how far she could have traveled from the moment she left campus until the witness spotted her. This helped narrow down a stretch of the journey where every possibility remained open, even though the area was still broad and full of blind spots. The area around Winchell had one striking feature the investigators quickly noted. The street lighting was far too weak, and the wide gaps between poles created long stretches of unbroken darkness. Each pool of light covered only a small circle before the next shadow swallowed the entire space. This made reconstructing the critical link between the witness encounter point and the spot where she might have been approached extremely difficult, since the large dark gaps allowed any movement to go unobserved. The sparse density of houses amplified the effect. Most homes sat far back from the street with deep front yards, and many were completely dark because porch lights were off. Investigators knocked on doors, asking if anyone had been awake that evening, but most said they had gone to bed early or hadn't heard anything unusual enough to notice. Kalamazoo's municipal camera system in 1986 offered almost no help. The only traffic cameras in the vicinity were positioned at major intersections far from the stretch of road where Elysia vanished. One camera mounted on the north side of Stadium Drive produced grainy footage with such low frame rates that small moving figures were impossible to distinguish. The team reviewed every inch of the tapes, hoping to spot headlights, a silhouette, or any other anomaly, but all they got were indistinct streaks of light and vehicles passing at too great a distance. When visual space yielded no clues, the team shifted to checking for auditory evidence. Several local residents reported hearing an irregular engine revving around the estimated time of Elysia's disappearance. Notably, 3 separate statements described the same distinctive sound, a short, sharp rev, as if a vehicle were flooring the gas to start or suddenly accelerate on cold pavement. One man who lived near the entrance to Milham Woods said he heard the noise coming from that direction, followed by the crunch of tires rolling over gravel and dry leaves. Although no one could pinpoint the exact bearing, the consistency in the descriptions drew special attention from the investigators. A second detail that helped narrow the investigation came from a woman living in a row of houses right next to Winchell. She recalled that on that night, she saw headlights sweep across her curtains for a brief moment. She didn't get up to check because she assumed it was just a neighbor coming home late. However, she distinctly remembered the light being very low and tinged with a deep yellowish hue, suggesting older-style headlights or a vehicle that wasn't stock. When paired with the accounts of the revving engine, the team began to suspect the presence of a small, low-powered vehicle that had been modified to run quietly but struggled when accelerating. This matched the characteristics of many compact pickup trucks common in the 1980s. In reports from the months leading up to Elysia's disappearance, several residents had mentioned seeing a dark-colored small pickup truck appearing around the area at random times. When the old notes were pulled, police realized the truck had been spotted at least 4 times parked in positions only a few blocks apart, sometimes in deep shadow, as if deliberately avoiding passers-by. No one had ever recorded the license plate, but the descriptions were consistent. A darkly painted body, and slightly elongated bed, and suspiciously quiet operation. Once all the facts were compiled, the small pickup truck emerged as a key element. The behavioral analysis group evaluated this data and drew conclusions step by step. The hooded man's approach to Elysia, the way he positioned himself to block her path, the convenient darkness for action, and the coincidental timing of the small pickup truck all formed a picture of a prepared sequence of behavior. There were no signs of impulsiveness or immediate motive. Every detail suggested the man knew the terrain well, knew the times when foot traffic was minimal, and knew how to approach Elysia in a space quiet enough to act without detection. The investigators continued documenting every assessment, strengthening the hypothesis that the perpetrator had been watching Elysia for some period of time before the night she vanished. As the search team expanded the radius from the last place Elysia was seen into the narrow alleys connecting to Winchell, an officer discovered her familiar bicycle propped upright right next to a low section of fence. The bike was positioned perfectly straight, the wheels aligned parallel to the curb. Handlebars turned outward as though someone had just stopped and dismounted calmly. This immediately caught the investigators' attention because, according to her roommate's description, Elysia always leaned her bike to the left, with the front wheel slightly turned inward, a personal habit she had maintained for years. The overly neat placement, completely devoid of her personal touch, created an eerie feeling, as though it had been arranged deliberately rather than left naturally by the victim. The investigators didn't just examine the bike, they also scrutinized the ground around it closely. The layer of dry leaves lay quite evenly, with no signs of piling or disturbance, as would occur if a bicycle had been set down by someone finishing a long ride. In areas where bikes were frequently used, the ground would normally show small streaks and scuff marks from both tires and shoes. But here, it was unnaturally clean. No footprints leading to the bike, no wheel turn marks, no drag marks or scuffs from athletic shoes. The surface was almost too perfect, as if someone had prepared the ground before placing the bicycle there. This abnormal cleanliness created a clear paradox. If Elysia had gotten off the bike herself, she would have left signs of movement, of gravity, of any instinctive action. At this scene, the investigators found the complete absence of all such movement. Something experience showed was often a hallmark of a manipulated crime scene. When they widened the sweep around the bike, an officer happened to catch a faint reflection from beneath the dry leaves, about 20 meters away from the bike's position. It was a broken, thin chain necklace, lying slightly to one side, not fully concealed. The chain had been pulled so hard that one small link snapped, causing the pendant to fall in a different direction. Elysia's friends later confirmed that she often wore a delicate silver chain with a teardrop-shaped pendant, and the piece found matched that description exactly. This discovery made the investigators pause longer, because the necklace's location didn't align at all with the bike's placement. If Elysia had dropped the necklace while dismounting, it should have landed much closer. The fact that it was so far away forced the team to conclude that a forceful movement had occurred in that area, entirely separate from the point where the bike was positioned. Crime scene technicians continued to examine the ground closely around the necklace's location. Some dry leaves were pressed flat to the earth, in a vague directional pattern, opposite to the random scattering caused by wind. Among those leaves, several small stones lay shifted along a long curve, completely unnatural. The investigators hypothesized that this could be evidence of an attempt to cover drag marks. Leaves and stones may have been used to obscure slide marks or body drag trails, which typically leave very noticeable paths if left uncovered. When they angled flashlights low across the ground, a thin, compressed strip of soil appeared in the shape of friction marks, uneven, but still showing a characteristic linear form. It wasn't deep enough to be definitive proof, but it was too formed to be random. This convinced the team that a collision or coercive action had taken place in the area, and the perpetrator had deliberately tried to conceal the traces. The more they observed, the more the investigators recognized the unnatural quality in every detail. The bike frame showed no fresh dirt, as though it had been wiped down. There were no wheel tracks on the ground, despite the bike being placed so neatly. The soil near the necklace also lacked heavy footprints, which would typically appear during a struggle. Yet the specific pattern of flattened leaves pointed to the movement of a human body being dragged. The combination of these contradictory signs created a picture that was both missing and excessive, but every detail led to the same conclusion. The perpetrator knew how to stage a scene. An experienced technician even pointed out that the pressed leaves had an uneven structure, as if the perpetrator had used a foot or a flat object to spread the layer evenly while attempting to erase traces. This suggested the cleanup was done in the dark with haste, but methodically. The likelihood of an ordinary person randomly achieving this level of cleanliness was extremely low. The neatly positioned bicycle, the necklace lying far from the bike, the signs of covered drag marks, the carefully groomed ground, all were pieces of a familiar technique seen in many professional abductions. A location staged to mislead investigators, creating the impression that the victim left the bike voluntarily or met with a random mishap. Yet each detail failed to match Elysia's natural behavior, as described by her family and friends. These successive findings led the team to record that this was no longer an area the victim had simply passed through. It was a deliberately chosen spot to create a false scene. The calculated placement of the bike, the erased drag marks, and the anomalous distance of the necklace were sufficient for the investigators to determine that a professional intervening hand had altered the area with the sole purpose of concealing what had truly happened to Elysia somewhere else. The area around where the bicycle was repositioned led straight into a narrow, dark footpath that ran deep into Milham Woods. This was a trail rarely used at night, mostly by pedestrians or neighborhood kids riding bikes during the day. As the investigative team swept the area with flashlights and wide-angle lighting equipment, an officer noticed a shoe print mixed into the thin layer of mud right at the transition point between the sidewalk and the trail. This print didn't match common patterns. The sole bore a 6-pointed star tread design, a rare pattern on the market, especially in the 1980s. The shoe size was fairly large, indicating the wearer was of average or above average height, with evenly distributed body weight, suggesting a calm and deliberate gait. What stood out was the direction of the prints. They led from the street inward, along the trail, with no return prints. The investigators measured the location, photographed the print from every angle, and continued deeper into the path. A few meters from the shoe print, a slight depression in the soil indicated additional heavy movement being dragged through, though the mark wasn't clear enough to definitively identify it as a body drag or just a small wheel rut. However, when the flashlight beam swept to the side, a long impression appeared on the ground. The tire track of a medium-sized small pickup truck, the kind commonly seen on older commercial vehicles or light cargo conversions. The axle width and tread pattern showed this wasn't an ordinary family car. The tire pattern still retained clear impressions of thick rubber blocks, consistent with load-bearing vehicles. This led the team to note the coincidence with earlier resident statements from people near Winchell who had heard an engine revving and tires crunching over dry leaves at precisely the time Elysia disappeared. To confirm the direction of travel more clearly, the investigators followed the tire tracks. The impressions weren't continuous, disappearing every few meters due to the forest floor's mix of dirt, gravel, and tree roots, but they were sufficient to establish that the vehicle had backed deep into the trail rather than stopping at the edge of the road. Technicians collected soil samples embedded in the tire grooves for comparison. This soil contained the characteristic brown mud of the Milham Park area, where high moisture levels result from intertwined roots and water-retaining ground in early autumn weather. When compared to soil samples from the bicycle placement area, the match in organic composition and moisture content suggested the vehicle had passed through both locations within the same time frame. This opened the hypothesis that the perpetrator may have parked inside the woods, walked out to the residential area to approach Elysia, then brought the victim back to the vehicle via the trail to maximize concealment. As the investigators moved deeper into the path, they used gloved hands to part the bushes on both sides, checking every branch. While sweeping light across a shadowed area, an officer spotted a red object clinging to a low branch. At first it looked like an ordinary scrap of fabric blown there by the wind, but when brought closer under the light, the team realized the fabric had a hand-woven structure, deep red in color, unlike any material from common clothing. It was so light that even a gentle breeze could carry it away. Yet it was caught horizontally in the leaf gaps, indicating it had come off something moving nearby. A technician examined the edge cut closely and noted it wasn't torn but appeared scraped away from a larger piece during forceful contact. Further inspection along both sides of the trail revealed a total of 3 additional red fibers, all of the same material and weave pattern. Their distribution, spaced along the trail in the direction deeper into the woods, suggested that a person or object carrying them had brushed against the bushes while moving through. Combined with the rare star-patterned shoe print and the tire tracks, these red fibers became another piece in the perpetrator's movement picture. To further strengthen the inference, the team examined differences between residential area soil and forest soil. Soil samples adhering to the recovered fibers matched the composition found in the tire grooves. Both contained high levels of forest microorganisms, fine-grained particles, and rich organic matter, distinctly different from the drier, less contaminated soil in the Winchell neighborhood. This reinforced the likelihood that any dragging or victim transport occurred along the trail inside Milham Woods, not right in the residential area. further demonstrating the perpetrator's deliberate choice of location. When all the traces were placed side by side, the rare star-pattern shoe print, the small pickup tire tracks, the presence of Milam mud, and the red fibers caught in the underbrush, the investigative team began to have enough basis for a preliminary conclusion. This footpath wasn't a random element in the case. It bore signs of purposeful movement. A discreet, low-light route, ideal for transporting a victim without drawing attention. Dim lighting, difficult to observe terrain, and the network of intersecting side paths created perfect conditions for the perpetrator to carry out the act unobserved. Based on the scene evidence, the investigators determined that the trail leading into Milham Woods had a very high probability of being the route the perpetrator used to move the victim. This opened a more specific line of inquiry, as the evidence was no longer scattered but linked into a chain, suggesting the crime did not occur in the residential neighborhood at all. Instead, it was transitioned into the secluded space of the woods, where abduction behavior was least likely to be detected. When information about Elysia's disappearance began spreading through the Winchell neighborhood, a middle-aged man proactively contacted the police, stating that he had seen a hooded figure appearing around the area on the evening of the disappearance. He lived less than 2 blocks from the stretch of road where the bicycle was found, often went for evening walks to lower his blood pressure, and had happened to pass through that area. His statement immediately drew the investigative team's attention, because the details he provided matched the first witness's description, yet the specifics carried a different nuance. He said the hooded man wasn't standing still in one spot but was pacing back and forth along the sidewalk in an observant manner, as though waiting for someone. His pace was slow, unhurried, but at times he would stop abruptly and turn to look toward the road leading into the Milham Woods trail. This made the man feel uneasy, but since there was no violent behavior or unusual noise, he didn't call the police at that moment. The investigators showed him the initial sketch description based on the previous witness's account, and he confirmed that the build and the way the hood was worn were very similar. Though he couldn't see the face clearly, he remembered the man repeatedly raising his hand to the edge of the hood as if to shield his face from the streetlight's glow. This gesture was repeated long enough for the witness to feel it wasn't a normal habit but rather an intentional effort to conceal his face. When asked about the timing, he gave a relative time frame that aligned closely with the window when Elysia was last seen before vanishing. This coincidence prompted the team to schedule him to return to the station the following day for a more detailed statement. However, when police arrived at the address he had provided, the small gray house at the end of the street was locked up, the mailbox stuffed with uncollected newspapers, and there were no signs of activity inside. The immediate neighbor reported seeing him leave the house early that morning carrying a small bag, after which he never returned. No one knew where he had gone. Calls from the police to the phone number he provided rang repeatedly before switching to a disconnected signal. The man's sudden disappearance drew significant attention because he left no message of any kind, and his departure occurred precisely when police wanted to question him more thoroughly about his observations. When checking residency records, police discovered that the man had once lived for a period in a suburban area where an abandoned ritual facility had stood since the late 1970s. The building had belonged to a small religious group with unclear activities. It later disbanded and was left vacant. Records noted multiple complaints from nearby residents about unfamiliar people coming and going from the property at night. There was no specific evidence of criminal activity at the time, so police had only monitored without deeper investigation. Nevertheless, the information about this second witness's former residence immediately put the investigators on alert, especially since the location was near the Milham Woods area where the tire tracks and red fibers had been found. This detail prompted the team to re-examine the red fibers collected from the trail. The forensics lab noted that the fibers had a hand-woven structure and an uncommon dye color. When cross-referenced with historical data on small religious groups in the Michigan area, some old documents described deep red ritual garments used by a group that had once operated near Van Buren County in Kalamazoo. This created a vague but noteworthy connection. The fibers found on the trail could belong to the type of clothing used by the group associated with the abandoned ritual site. The fact that the witness vanished right when police wanted to question him made coincidence hard to accept. His link to the abandoned ritual site was no longer a random detail. Investigators began to suspect that he may not have been merely a witness, but could have had a deeper connection to individuals present around the time of Alicia's disappearance. They did not rule out the possibility that he had once been a member of, or had ties to a group operating within a closed community structure, especially given the evasive nature of his disappearance in avoiding contact with law enforcement. The alignment between his statement about the hooded man, his unexplained vanishing, the rare shoe print pattern, and the red fibers bearing ritual-like characteristics led police to realize this was no longer just an ordinary abduction. These small but consistently pointing clues caused the investigative team to start questioning whether multiple individuals were involved, rather than a lone perpetrator. This opened a new assessment. There was a possibility of an organized group operating in secrecy that could be directly or indirectly connected to Alicia's disappearance. The forensics team continued analyzing the chain of evidence collected from the trail leading into Milham Woods, with particular focus on the red fabric fibers caught in the underbrush. Under the microscope, the structure of each fiber became much clearer. The threads were hand-twisted from small strands, following no industrial standard whatsoever. The twist was uneven, with varying elasticity between segments, indicating this was not mass-produced fabric. The dye color was also not a common commercial one for clothing at the time. It carried a deep reddish-brown hue, resembling handmade dyes derived from plant roots or mineral pigments. The fact that these hand-woven fibers, dyed with an unusual formula and shedding in pieces when rubbed against branches, strongly suggested the garment or fabric item had been custom-made for a special purpose rather than everyday wear. This led the investigative team to seriously consider the possibility that the fibers came from ritual attire. While re-examining the trail under angled lighting, an investigator spotted a small carved mark on a dry wooden post at the edge of the path. The wood surface was shallowly cut, but the lines were sharp and deliberate. The shape of the symbol bore no resemblance to typical graffiti. It consisted of 3 intersecting diagonal lines forming an elongated sun-like figure, with a small arc positioned at the bottom. The carving showed no scribbling or irregularity of a hasty act. Instead, the strokes were careful and purposefully repeated. Technicians took a clay impression of the carving, recording the blade direction and cut depth. These characteristics suggested the symbol had been made with a sharp tool, not an ordinary pocket knife. The investigators consulted numerous local symbology references but found no match between this symbol and any gang or regional criminal organization markings. It also didn't resemble any script or linguistic symbol. An older document in the police department's archived files, related to small belief groups active in the 1970s and 1980s, mentioned that some groups used symbols in place of public names, especially those operating in isolation from the community and in wooded areas or abandoned buildings. Although the document did not describe this specific symbol, the documented existence of esoteric symbols in Michigan prompted the team to consider a potential connection. The recurring details pointing toward ritual elements, the handmade red fibers, the unusual shoe print, the vanished witness linked to an old ritual site, and now, a carved symbol in the woods, urged the investigative team to evaluate the possibility that this was not the work of a lone individual. They began discussing the hypothesis of involvement by an extremist belief group or a small, secretive community. Initial analysis showed signs of premeditation in the crime. Selection of an isolated location with no foot traffic, creation of a false scene with the bicycle, thorough cleanup to erase footprints, and a clearly organized escape route via the trail. Such characteristics are commonly found in ritualistic crimes, where the perpetrator or group does not act impulsively, but follows a planned process infused with symbolic elements. The investigators reviewed files on fringe groups operating in Michigan during the 1980s. Many had disbanded, but left lingering traces in the community. Groups that performed rituals by lunar calendar, groups claiming to purify souls, groups that isolated themselves in northern wooded regions. Some of these groups had used red garments during gatherings, and the recovered red fibers created a noteworthy coincidence. The team analyzed the nature of the case. Alicia was a young victim who vanished without a trace in a dark, quiet area. Conditions fitting the victim selection patterns seen in many extremist belief models. The signs of covered drag marks and the staged scene indicated the perpetrator wanted to conceal the true initial location of the incident, a tactic often used when a ritual takes place elsewhere, and the bicycle discovery site serves only as a transfer point. This information led the investigative team to unanimously expand their approach toward premeditated ritual crime. A rare category, but one that aligned with the tangible evidence. The red fibers became central evidence in this new investigative direction, as they rarely appear in ordinary crimes. If they indeed belong to ritual attire, their origin could potentially be traced back to a group or individual who once possessed such garments. One investigator suggested comparing the fiber samples with collections of religious or fringe group clothing held at local universities and museums, which often preserve handmade dye samples and descriptions of traditional attire from small communities. With the second witness having vanished without a trace and having previously lived near an abandoned ritual facility, the team noted this could be a crucial link between the case and an organized group that once operated in the area. Case-solving experience showed that the unusual disappearance of an information provider is rarely mere coincidence, especially when the person exhibits signs of evasion after realizing police interest. This made suspicions of an underground network increasingly clear. The investigators continued documenting every detail, searching old records related to extremist belief groups, and simultaneously analyzing the items dropped in the woods alongside the scene cleanup signs. When placed side by side, the picture no longer remained confined to a simple abduction. It took on the coloration of a ritualistic act, premeditated and executed by individuals knowledgeable about symbols, group structure, and methods of concealing traces within the natural space of Milham Woods. The forensics lab received all the red fabric fibers collected from the Milham Woods trail and began the detailed analysis process. When examined under an electron microscope, the dye structure revealed faint streaking and uneven color distribution, clear signs of an ancient organic dye, typically made from plant roots or sedimentary minerals, rather than the commercial pigments commonly used in the textile industry during the 1980s. The fabric's color spectrum leaned toward a deep reddish-brown tone, rarely seen in industrial products, indicating handmade production with multi-layer dyeing techniques that required experience or adherence to a ritualistic process. When individual dyed fibers were separated for compositional analysis, technicians detected traces of a plant resin once used by small belief groups in Michigan during rituals in the 1970s and early 1980s, according to historical documents from a researcher on extremist religions submitted to a local university. This discovery drew strong attention from the investigative team, as this type of dye was almost non-existent outside the scope of groups that used ritual garments. When comparing the red fabric samples to descriptions of attire in collected archival cultural materials including research books, cult reports, and illustrated descriptions, the examination team noted significant similarities. A secretive belief group once active near Van Buren County was documented as using long, deep red cloaks with wide sleeves and lightly slit seams so that, during movement, the fabric would brush against bushes and produce a faint whispering sound. This description matched the condition of the recovered fibers perfectly. They were scraped from the edges by horizontal pulling force, with the fiber edges slightly frayed in exactly the way handmade material reacts to strong friction. The length of each fiber was measured in millimeters to determine their likely position on the garment. Technicians observed that the fibers had nearly equivalent average lengths, with the fraying located precisely at the ritual sleeve edge position, where fabric typically comes loose first upon contact with branches. Investigators reconstructed the garment to scale based on fiber length and weave pattern, concluding that these fibers had almost certainly been scraped from a wide sleeve, not from the hem or waistband. Wide sleeves are a prominent feature of many symbolic ritual garments, where the color red represents sacrifice, purification, or released light, according to descriptions in several ancient documents. When considering the combined evidence alongside the rare star-pattern shoe print and the drag marks on the ground, the investigative team determined that at least 2 people were involved on the night Alicia disappeared. The shoe print indicated one adult wearing large-sized shoes moving deep into the woods, while the uneven soil depressions and changing drag direction suggested the presence of a second person providing assistance. The distribution of the red fibers, one caught on the left side of the underbrush, two on the right, created a more complex movement pattern, as though two people walked side by side or took turns moving through the area. There was no reasonable explanation for a single individual to produce this distribution pattern, especially given the near-symmetrical spacing between the fiber drop locations. This led the investigative team to confidently record, "The abduction was organized, not a lone act." The new evidence prompted the investigation to expand into a broader scope, focusing on tracing the origin of this particular weave style and distinctive dye. Investigators contacted multiple experts in handmade textiles and Michigan ritual culture to determine whether any groups still preserved techniques for organic red dyeing. A museum curator in Grand Rapids confirmed that the hand-twisted weave and deep brownish-red dye were characteristic of several belief groups that once operated in closed community models. These groups typically hid in wooded areas or abandoned structures, avoided social contact, and maintained connections only among members. Michigan's religious and cultural records from the early 1980s also referenced a group that used red garments during closed gatherings. This group was described as having an internal symbol system and believing in a rite of light transfer, in which red attire represented living energy. Although the group disbanded and sharply reduced activity around 1983, numerous documents speculated that some members split off and continued operating independently or in small-scale forms. The appearance of red fibers in Millam Woods at the same time as a meticulously staged disappearance strongly inclined the investigators toward the possibility that individuals possessing this distinctive weaving and dyeing technique still existed, or at least some remnant of them remained active. To broaden the investigation, police compiled a list of all isolated communities, loose belief groups, or underground organizations in the Kalamazoo area from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s. These records included groups living in the woods, groups that had separated from society, and those described as using red garments for ritual purposes. When synthesizing all the facts, the ancient dye, handmade weaving method, similarity to ritual cloaks, multi-person movement pattern, scattered fiber traces, and mysterious shoe print, the investigative team placed primary focus on the hypothesis that the red evidence was the most crucial key from the beginning of the case. It not only identified the type of garment present at the scene but also opened a new investigative direction, tracking down the group or individuals who once owned or used this fabric. Every piece of data pointed toward the existence of an extremist belief community operating quietly, with its own system of garments and rituals, and potentially responsible for Alicia's disappearance. As the investigators continued digging deeper into the Milham Woods area to follow the traces indicating multiple people moving through on the night Alicia disappeared, they expanded the survey range to include the scattered abandoned structures within the forest. On old topographic maps, a small wooden cabin was marked several hundred meters farther southwest. It had previously been used as a hunting season shelter. The cabin no longer appeared on newer maps because it had been abandoned for many years, with no clear path leading to it anymore. This made it a potential site to check, especially since the evidence from the trail suggested the perpetrator had moved deeper into the woods. When the investigative team approached the cabin, they realized its structure was now just a charred wooden frame. Blackened planks lay piled on top of one another. The roof had completely collapsed, and the main doorpost was broken in half. Although the cabin had been burned sometime earlier, the ground beneath still retained thick patches of ash mixed with dark brown slippery soil. Crime scene technicians used protein test sticks for a quick check and recorded a positive reaction, indicating human blood had soaked into the soil before the cabin was set ablaze. The burned soil appeared layered as though it had been scorched in multiple stages, making separation of materials difficult, but the blood evidence could not be completely concealed. This was an anomaly because the cabin's burning had seemed like an accident or the result of long-term abandonment, yet the presence of human blood in the ash layer suggested the cabin may have been the site of violent behavior. While examining the remaining cabin supports, an investigator noticed that the charred wood exposed an inner carved layer, Right beneath the peeling charcoal, sharp, tightly composed lines appeared. Two interlocking circles, with three radiating diagonal rays like beams of light. Part of the symbol had been burned away, but enough remained to show the refinement in the carving. When examined closely under angled light, the grooves were deeper than average, indicating a sharp tool had been used deliberately. These symbols immediately reminded the investigative team of the carving found on the wooden post along the trail. Not identical, but similar in style. Symmetry, clear angles, and form suggestive of light or energy symbols. Technicians photographed the markings and took wood samples, planning to compare the carvings to determine whether the two symbols could originate from the same group or even the same hands. When the information about the burned cabin was cross-referenced with old records, the investigative team discovered that the cabin had once been owned by a man named Jonas Hale. Hale appeared in Kalamazoo residency records from the late 1970s, with a rather obscure background. No steady employment, lived reclusively, minimal contact with neighbors, and abruptly left the area a few years later. There were no transfer documents or precise information about where he went. What was even more unusual was that Hale had been named in 3 separate reports related to minor disappearances in the forested area during the time when the cabin was still intact. In one case, a teenager who vanished while camping near Milham Woods was found several days later in a state of panic, unable to give a coherent statement. The boy repeatedly said he had seen red light and people in long robes. Although there wasn't enough evidence to establish criminal activity, Hale was recorded as the last person seen near the area. In another report, an elderly woman living on the forest's edge stated she had seen Hale carrying long wooden objects resembling poles or panels and moving into the woods at night. When police followed up, Hale never reappeared, and the cabin remained closed for months afterward. There was no clear connection between these events, but they formed an unusual pattern tied to Hale's activities in the area. The cabin survey results suggested this was not merely an abandoned shelter, but possibly a site used for some form of ritual. The carved symbols inside the cabin, the red fibers on the trail, and the traces in the woods combined to indicate a space used for belief-related purposes. A reference document on extremist beliefs, once circulating in Michigan, described a rite of purification, a ritual conducted in enclosed spaces, involving firelight and the use of red items symbolizing cleansing. The cabin displayed many features matching this description: multi-layered burn marks, blood-soaked soil, and carvings located in a private space. The investigators pieced together a possible scenario. The cabin may have been a place where a group once performed symbolic rituals, possibly purification, or a transfer rite. The burning of the cabin was unlikely to have been accidental, and may have been a deliberate act to erase traces after a ritual concluded or following some unusual event. When comparing burn severity, the examination team determined the cabin had burned at least twice in different years. One fire collapsed the roof. A second many years later left the remaining wood partially charred, characteristic of arson intended to obliterate past evidence rather than a natural blaze. Every detail at the cabin scene connected coherently to the expanding chain of evidence. The red material, the unusual shoe print, the vanished witness, and now a location bearing ritual indicators. The burned cabin raised many questions but also revealed the possibility that it was a crucial link in the network of an extremist belief group's activities. Although it could not yet be confirmed whether the cabin was directly related to the night Elysia disappeared, every element found there created a noteworthy connection to the emerging picture. An organized group with its own symbols, secret operating locations, and the disappearance of Hale, the cabin's owner, only heightened suspicion around this enigmatic figure. Records related to extremist belief groups in the area were pulled from the Kalamazoo archives, from neighboring county sheriff departments, and even from research documents by several local scholars. Among them, the group that drew the investigators' strongest attention was a little-known sect called Luminous Path. Documentation on this group was sparse, scattered across various old files, largely because the group operated in secrecy, did not publicly disclose its doctrines, and did not recruit in traditional ways. Luminous Path viewed itself as illuminators of the path of ancient light, a concept that appeared sporadically in a few handwritten manuscripts the police obtained from multiple sources. Their core doctrine centered on an extreme belief that the world was shrouded by the fog of tainted souls, and only the chosen ones, called bearers of light, could help open the gate of purification, leading the world to a purer state. One portion of old documents described the central ritual of Luminous Path as the light offering, roughly translated as the offering of light. Although no complete description existed, handwritten fragments and statements from old witnesses in the 1970s indicated that this ritual required the presence of a chosen individual, usually young, possessing strong spirit and clear mind. In the sex phrasing, these descriptions were extremely vague, but the coincidence with Alicia's characteristics, intelligent, gentle, calm, demeanor, and frequently described by friends as radiating a soft warmth, caught the investigators' notice. Followers of Luminous Path believed that a bearer of light, when released in the proper manner, would generate purifying energy and open the gate they sought. In a document collected by police in 1978, there was a note stating that Luminous Path does not perform rituals in winter because dark energy is obscured, and autumn is the time when light transfer is strongest. This sent a shock through the investigative team when placed beside the timing of Alicia's disappearance in early autumn evening. The alignment between the ritual season and the case timing did not prove anything directly, but it created a noteworthy connection. Even more strikingly, Jonas Hale's cabin, the man indirectly linked to several unusual incidents, sat within Milham Woods, a secluded, dark space perfectly suited for secret rituals. Old residency records showed that Jonas Hale had participated in a small belief group in 1979, though the specific name of the group was not stated. When cross-checked against a membership list of Luminous Path compiled by a scholar in 1982, the investigative team noticed the list had been altered. Many names were crossed out or replaced with symbols, but the most striking feature was 4 positions where names had been completely removed, leaving blank spaces. Faint pencil traces underneath suggested the original list did not match the archived version. Researchers at the time estimated the group had 12 to 15 active members, but the record showed only 8, all listed as witness bearers, meaning those who performed rituals rather than leaders. Digging deeper, police discovered that the 4 erased names were all connected, directly or through residency, to densely wooded areas or abandoned cabins in Van Buren County and Kalamazoo. There was no official explanation for why their names were struck, but the alteration raised the possibility that they held key roles potentially involved in higher secrecy rituals that were harder to detect. In Michigan State Police old files, the investigative team uncovered a case that had been closed without full resolution, a disappearance in 1981. The victim was a young woman, about 22 years old, who vanished under vague circumstances while walking near a forested area in Allegan County. No body was found, and no clear evidence of crime emerged. The case was closed with the conclusion, insufficient data. However, 2 years later, a local newspaper article raised questions about Luminous Path because a witness had seen a group of people in red garments leaving the woods on the night the victim disappeared. Police at the time could not verify it because no one was clearly identified, and there was no legal basis for deeper pursuit. The matter faded into silence. The fact that Jonas Hale's cabin linked indirectly to strange cases contained carved symbols similar to the one on the trail post further convinced the investigative team that Hale played a role in Luminous Path. Numerous documents indicated that this sect operated in a fragmented model. No large gatherings, no public recruitment, and each small branch functioning under the guidance of a group head. If Jonas Hale had once been the head of a branch, his cabin was highly likely to have served as the ritual center for that group. A researcher who had tracked extremist beliefs in Michigan wrote in a 1984 document that Luminous Path used red as a symbol of transfer, and their ritual garments were hand-woven from organic materials in deep red, exactly matching the fiber samples police recovered from Milham Woods. The description was so precise that the investigators were nearly certain the red fibers were direct evidence of Luminous Path's presence in the area at the time of Alicia's disappearance. Some handwritten letters in the old files, written by former members who had left Luminous Path, mentioned that the major ritual, the light offering, was usually performed in autumn because it was the phase when material and light energies harmonize. These notes, though steeped in vague mysticism, aligned eerily with the circumstances of the case, making the investigators extremely cautious in their assessment. The documents also referred to selecting bearers of light based on vital essence and purity of appearance. A description hard to quantify but fitting the pattern of many unsolved disappearances where victims were young, gentle, introverted, or possessed qualities interpreted as pure by extremist groups. When all the facts were placed into one framework, the burned cabin with carved symbols, ritual red fibers, the vanished witness linked to an old ritual site, and the history of unresolved disappearances, the investigative team could not overlook the possibility that Luminous Path was a critical link in the case. The removal of 4 names from the official membership list led the team to suspect that those individuals had continued operating covertly even after the rest of the sect disbanded. And if Luminous Path's ritual required a bearer of light, then Alicia's disappearance, a young woman with a gentle personality, and described by many as shining in her own way, fit disturbingly well with the group's victim selection pattern. The Luminous Path file not only expanded the scope of the investigation, but also raised a major question. Had this sect truly vanished as public records claimed, or did a branch still operate quietly in the Milham Woods region? As the evidence regarding Luminous Path became increasingly clear, the investigative team focused on the remaining membership list of the sect. The official list recorded by researchers contained only 8 names, but the blurred gaps in the documents indicated that at least 4 key members had been removed from the records. This made tracing them difficult, as the individuals erased from the list were precisely those most likely to have continued operating in secrecy or held important roles in the rituals. Nevertheless, the investigative team started with the 8 remaining individuals who had been documented as witness bearers lower rank but still participants in the rituals. Each member was entered into an analysis list, including residency history, medical records, employment information, and movements over the years. Some disappeared from civil records after 1984. Others moved to different counties in Michigan, lived reclusively, or left the state without leaving clear traces. The investigative force divided the data by age group, periods of recorded activity, and potential connection to Jonas Hale's cabin. All data was spread across a large board, pinned and connected with red string marking possible links. When reviewing immigration and residency records, one striking anomaly stood out. Many members formerly of Luminous Path had periods of 2 to 4 years where they appeared in no civil records whatsoever. No utility bills, no new driver's license registrations, no medical visits. In employment files, some quit jobs abruptly without notice and left no forwarding address. These information gaps were not random coincidences but followed an extremely consistent pattern. They vanished from society during the same time frames. This led the investigative team to hypothesize that they may have lived in closed communities or secret locations such as Jonas Hale's cabin during periods of active belief practice. Records of name changes appeared in at least 3 cases. In a declaration filed with the Van Buren County Health Department in 1983, a man named Marcus L. was recorded as switching to a new name just 3 months after leaving the community where he had lived. A woman named Claire P. also suddenly changed her surname, explaining to local authorities that she wanted to close the past. Another case noted a member who self-altered his birth date in tax records, an illegal act, but hard to detect at the time. These identity changes formed a pattern of avoiding social interaction, reinforcing the assessment that the sect continued operating in the shadows, at least in some branches. When cross-referencing old documents by timeline, the investigative team realized Luminous Path had not completely dissolved as many early 1980s newspaper articles claimed. Instead, the group appeared to have fragmented into several small branches, each with a few loyal members continuing their own rituals. Scattered reports from Van Buren and Allegan counties noted sightings of small groups walking in the woods at night, wearing long robes or cloaks. These descriptions were insufficient to form charges, but matched the ritual garment pattern confirmed by the forensics team from the red fibers. From the list of members still appearing in records, the investigative team narrowed down those likely still living in the Kalamazoo or Van Buren area. Among them, 3 names stood out: a man who had worked as a carpenter, a woman who had registered for herbal healing studies, and one who had once lived with Jonas Hale during the cabin's active period. Their occupational and residency histories placed them no more than 40 minutes' drive from Milham Woods, a close enough distance to maintain covert activity. The timing of Elysia's disappearance coincided with periods when all 3 had no recorded work attendance or financial transactions, drawing special attention from the investigative team. While analyzing files, the investigators found a statement from a former Van Buren County resident who had reported to police seeing 2 people in red cloaks walking together in the woods at the end of September, in an unspecified year. The location was described as an area with a small trail surrounded by dense trees, a description strikingly similar to Milham. When cross-checked with residency data, this time frame aligned with the window during which Jonas Hale and 2 other members vanished from residency records. Although the description could not be used to draw a firm conclusion, the level of coincidence led the team to view it as an indication that Luminous Path may have continued performing rituals on a cyclical basis. When piecing together the facts, individuals who changed identities, those who relocated without trace, those who once lived near the cabin, those with histories of extremist belief, the investigative team began to identify a small group with a high likelihood of involvement in secret activities around the time of Elysia's disappearance. An analysis board was constructed, marking individuals who might have known or worked with Jonas Hale, along with those who appeared together in belief-related records. Within this group, 3 had migration paths consistent with the Milham Woods vicinity, and all had gaps in their personal records right around the time of the disappearance. The investigators could not overlook the striking similarities between descriptions of Luminous Path's rituals and the traces found in Milham Woods: red cloaks, autumn rituals, symbolic carvings, and the selection of victims bearing light characteristics. This led the investigative team to flag a list of potential suspects, not based on prior crimes, but on their history of affiliation with the sect, residency locations, and evasive behavior. Although there was still no direct evidence linking them to the night Elysia vanished, these factors caused the team to conclude that a group of people remained active, dispersed, but unified in ideology, and they had the potential to have played a role in a ritual connected to the case. In the 2 years after Elysia disappeared, the investigative force poured all its energy into chasing leads, combing through the woods, interviewing dozens of witnesses, and trying to connect every scattered clue into a logical chain of events. But the very complexity of the case, combined with the severe limitations of 1980s investigative infrastructure, led to a series of unavoidable mistakes that gradually pushed the entire matter into the shadows of cold case files. One of the most serious errors stemmed from the primitive evidence storage system. The red fibers collected from the trail, the single most important lead at the time, were stored together with soil samples from the cabin in an unlabeled container. This made it impossible for the forensics lab to distinguish which sample came from which location, stalling analysis for months. Other pieces of evidence, like the pressed leaves and the stones mixed with organic fibers, were also misclassified into the miscellaneous natural samples category instead of potential ritual samples. By the time the forensics team realized the mistake, many samples had lost their legal value because their chain of custody and original condition could no longer be guaranteed. This loss and confusion significantly weakened the chance to extract forensic value from the initial evidence collected. Another regrettable issue arose in the crude DNA report conducted at the end of 1987. DNA technology was still in its infancy and extremely limited at the time, but technicians still performed a preliminary analysis on the blood traces recovered from beneath the ash layer in the burned cabin. The report showed a match to the Hale family line in residency data, a suspicious but highly significant result. However, because the reliability of DNA technology was still low, and because the report only suggested a possible family line match rather than identifying a specific individual, the investigators at the time did not pursue this lead further. The analysis file was simply noted, insufficient legal significance. This caused one of the key links connecting Jonas Hale's cabin to the case to be overlooked, sinking deeper into storage without mention for many years. During the initial investigation, police had also identified several primary persons of interest, including those seen near the Winchell area and individuals previously connected to the cabin. But at that time, they lacked the scientific tools to compare soil samples, analyze fiber structure, or precisely match shoe prints the way modern techniques allow. As a result, many suspects were cleared based solely on criteria such as no prior criminal record, no clear motive, or cannot be proven present at the scene. In a complex case with ritualistic elements, eliminating suspects using standard criminal behavior criteria was a major mistake. Individuals with histories of extremist belief, or who lived in isolation like Hale, should have been investigated more thoroughly, but they were dismissed for lack of evidence. The investigative mindset of the era geared toward conventional violent crime left police insufficiently attuned to recognize the signs of organized ritual crime, which is always sophisticated, illogical by normal standards, and highly structured. On top of that, Luminous Path was never properly investigated. Despite numerous indirect clues such as the red garments, carved symbols, the burned cabin, and the mysterious disappearances of members, there was no direct evidence at the time that would have justified a large-scale probe into a belief group. This caution led to the decision to merely note the group in the unusual activity category without deeper follow-up. Although residency records showed several members had made suspicious identity changes, the absence of specific criminal records prevented police from initiating the necessary legal requests. Documents describing autumn rituals, the requirement for a bearer of light, and the history of similar unsolved disappearances were never compiled into an official investigative direction. Toward the end of the decade, the dwindling of remaining leads caused the case to fade further. Soil samples, shoe prints, and fragmented witness statements lacked the strength to keep the case at high priority. The investigative activity log clearly stated that by the end of 1988, Elysia's file was moved to the ongoing but inactive category, a form of temporary suspension due to lack of progress. This meant the case no longer received dedicated personnel and would only be revisited if new evidence surfaced. With the technological limitations of the time, no additional scientific traces could be exploited. These mistakes were not due to lack of care, but to a lack of technical capability and awareness of organized ritual crime. Crimes following cult-like patterns were incompatible with the standard investigative thinking of that period. Investigators then had to rely on direct physical evidence, most of which had been erased or tampered with, so they could not reconstruct the full picture of the case. When every investigative angle hit a dead end, the case gradually receded from internal bulletins and lost investigative momentum. By the end of 1988, the file showed no significant progress. Ritual indicators were deemed insufficient basis. Hale's cabin was too deteriorated for further analysis. The witness who had seen the hooded man had vanished, and technology was not yet advanced enough to exploit DNA traces or fibers. Under those circumstances, the case was officially classified as a cold case. This marked the temporary end of all efforts to uncover the truth behind Elysia's disappearance at that time, and the question of what had happened to her was sealed away in the silence of unsolved files. In 2015, nearly 3 decades after Elysia's case was classified as a cold case, a completely unexpected event occurred at a flea market on the outskirts of Kalamazoo. An elderly man who collected antique books and religious artifacts bought an old wooden crate from a garage sale simply because it resembled items once used in Michigan belief groups from the 1970s. When he opened the crate, he found several sheets of paper, a few blurry photographs, and a dark red-dyed leather-bound notebook, moldy at the edges and clearly forgotten for many years. He took everything home and spent his weekend sorting through it. It wasn't until he turned to the 3rd page of the notebook that he realized this was no ordinary journal. It was a kind of ritual diary. The first line, written in sharp pen strokes at the top of the page, read, "Ascension Rite." The term immediately put him on alert. Although not an expert, he had read some material on extremist belief groups in Michigan, including Luminous Path. He decided to contact the police to turn over the notebook, because the strange descriptions inside went far beyond the scope of personal collecting. When the investigative team received the diary, the investigators quickly recognized that the document described a ritual with a clear structure, specific objectives, timing, and roles for participants. The entries in the notebook did not name anyone, using only symbols, but they detailed the offering of light ritual, which matched the concept Luminous Path had once pursued. Across many pages, the ritual centered on a figure called the Bearer of Light. This person was described as pure in essence, strong in spirit, and in harmony with the movement of the season. These descriptions, when placed beside what Elysia's friends and professors had said about her, created a terrifying similarity. In particular, the diary emphasized that the bearer of light was usually a young woman with stable emotions who emitted a radiant vibration when present among the community. This was typical language of extremist belief groups. But when the investigative team compared it to Elysia's psychological and social profile, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. Another detail in the diary raised the level of suspicion even higher. The previous ascension has failed. The sentence appeared twice on different pages, but without any specific explanation. However, based on scattered documents about Luminous Path, the group had carried out a major ritual in the early 1980s. The ritual failing in the group's terms could mean the chosen victim escaped, the ritual did not proceed correctly, or the group did not achieve the outcome they believed necessary to open the gate of purification. If a failure had occurred, it could explain why, in 1986, when Luminous Path had supposedly disbanded on paper, signs appeared that a new ritual was being prepared. Another passage in the notebook was very short, but chilling. Another light must rise. And immediately after, on the next page, in stronger, sharper handwriting, she arrived at the right time. No name, no clear description, just an absolute statement. The investigators who read this section immediately paused. The use of the pronoun she, combined with the assertion that this person's appearance came at exactly the right moment for the ritual, suggested the group had selected a suitable victim precisely during the transfer season they believed was most important, autumn. Elysia vanished on an early autumn evening, in a secluded area near Milham Woods, where a cabin had once been used for ritual purposes. This made the phrase "she arrived at the right time" almost impossible to interpret any other way. The investigators continued reading deeper into the following pages. Some symbols matched the carvings found in the burned cabin and on the wooden post near the trail. They appeared scattered at the page edges, sometimes as the writer's confirmation mark, sometimes as ritual decoration. One section described the number of participants in the main ritual. 4 people, including 1 ritual leader, 2 light holders, and 1 path chooser. This aligned with what the investigative team had inferred about the number of people present in the woods based on shoe prints and the distribution of fabric fragments. Another detail in the diary read, "The offering must be made before the final moon wanes. Delay corrupts the light." This reinforced the timing element. The ritual was cyclical, tied to seasons and lunar phases. Elysia's disappearance fell squarely within that cycle, when the diary described the gate-open period for the major ritual. Amid those haunting descriptions, the investigative team found a faded but still legible section with the letters M. Ham. When connected to place names in the area, they were nearly certain the word referred to Milham, the very woods where the red fibers and burned cabin had been discovered. This further proved the notebook was not mere fantasy or meaningless notes, but a document belonging to a group that had once operated in the exact area where Elysia vanished. When synthesizing every piece of information from the diary, the Ascension Rite ritual, the description of the Bearer of Light, the mention of a previous failed ritual, the symbols matching the scene, and especially the phrase, "she arrived at the right time," the investigative team no longer viewed this as coincidence. Everything converged on the same conclusion. The diary was very likely referring to Elysia as the chosen victim for an extremist religious ritual. The notebook, discovered by chance in an old crate, unexpectedly became the most important key in reopening a cold case that had lingered for nearly 3 decades. In 2024, after the ritual diary was entered into the case file, the investigative agency decided to conduct a comprehensive inventory of all evidence related to Elysia's disappearance samples collected back in 1986 but forgotten, misclassified, or impossible to analyze with the technology of that era. A dedicated storage room was reopened, where old metal boxes containing evidence were still sealed with time-faded tape. Many young technicians had to wear double gloves while carefully moving each box one by one, since some samples had been sealed nearly 4 decades earlier. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was a hair sample, a single strand not belonging to Elysia, found about 3 meters from the bicycle's location. At the time, because DNA technology was not yet developed, the hair was placed in the no evidentiary value category. But now, with advanced PCR DNA amplification techniques, examiners could isolate individual gene segments even from just a few remaining molecules. The initial analysis results showed the hair belonged to a man carrying genetic markers from a lineage that had resided around the Milham Woods area during the 1970s and 1980s. This result matched the Hale family line in regional ancestry data, a highly notable finding, especially since Jonas Hale's cabin had emerged as a central focus of the investigation. The blood sample from the burned cabin was also reopened for analysis. Previously, only basic reaction tests had confirmed the presence of hemoglobin. Those tests were not sensitive enough to determine origin or sex. Using modern protein separation techniques, a method that allows recovery of amino acid structures in aged blood samples, technicians discovered the blood came from 2 sources, one male, one female. This reinforced the hypothesis that the cabin had been the site of a ritual involving multiple people. The female blood sample could not be identified due to heavy degradation, but the male blood carried markers consistent with the genetic subgroup in the hair sample. Preliminary conclusion: the cabin had been visited by at least one individual sharing genetic characteristics with the Hale family, or those closely tied to the Luminous Path network. While continuing to search through the evidence boxes, a technician discovered a small paper packet at the bottom of box number 14. The box originally logged as containing soil samples and debris from the cabin. The packet was so old it was nearly crumbling, wrapped in thin hemp twine. When opened, a thin circular metal piece the size of a large coin emerged, covered in thick oxidation. The metal surface was no longer shiny, but faint engraved lines were still visible. After gentle cleaning, the shape became clear. It was the exact same symbol found inside the cabin. 2 interlocking circles with 3 radiating diagonal rays, like beams of light. The object was later named the Ascension Seal, the ritual seal of Luminous Path. Strangely, this piece of evidence had never been listed in the 1986 collection log. No signature, no evidence code, no date. It was as though the item had been overlooked or found but never entered into the official record. Forensics moved on to analyze the metal piece. On the oxidized surface, they noted numerous small protein specks. Under UV light, several streaks showed biological fluorescence. Using chemical fingerprint scanning technology, technicians detected ancient, faded fingerprints that still retained enough ridge structure for classification. Fatty acid degradation analysis on residues adhering to the metal surface dated the fingerprints to around 1986, the same time frame as the cabin fire and Elysia's disappearance. This was an extremely valuable discovery, because it proved the metal piece had been handled or used right around the time the ritual took place. It also confirmed that the Ascension Seal truly belonged to the ritual and was not a random object in the woods. When cross-referencing the reanalyzed evidence, a clearer picture began to emerge. The hair sample matched the Hale lineage. The cabin blood came from a male sharing the same genetic subgroup. The symbol on the Ascension Seal matched the carvings in the cabin, and the red fibers had a structure consistent with Luminous Path ritual garments. Everything converged on the same focal point. The cabin had once been the site of a significant ritual, and that ritual involved at least 2 people, one of whom was very likely from the Hale family or closely connected to them. Up to this point, the chain of evidence had far surpassed speculation or vague hypotheses. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the case had sufficient scientific elements to reopen the file. No longer indirect indicators, these were measurable, verifiable, and cross-referenceable pieces of evidence. The hair sample, cabin blood, red fibers, and ascension seal metal piece connected tightly in ways previous investigators could never have seen. Although the case still had many gaps, the newly reanalyzed evidence chain carried enough forensic weight to compel the investigative agency to reassess the entire Elysia file as an organized ritual crime, not a solitary disappearance. The genetics analysis lab received all the new data from the hair sample, cabin blood, and organic traces adhering to the ascension seal. These pieces of evidence, once considered unanalyzable, now became the foundation for an entirely new approach: genetic genealogy, a method of tracing identity through DNA family trees that had already proven effective in many complex major crimes. The DNA recovered from the hair sample yielded the clearest results. Although the genome was incomplete, it contained enough genetic markers to construct a reasonably accurate family tree map. When analyzing the SNP segments and cross-referencing them with Michigan residency data, the technicians discovered strong matches with 3 family lines in the southwestern part of the state. Among them, the Hale lineage stood out with a match frequency well above normal statistical thresholds. When expanding the analysis to the cabin blood sample, the one originating from a male, the technicians noticed that the 2 sets of genetic markers ran almost parallel, indicating they came from 2 individuals within the same family tree but not full siblings. This led the testing team to conclude that one of the 2 DNA profiles likely belonged to a collateral branch of the Jonas Hale family, a nephew, cousin, or close relative from the next generation. The matching gene segments proved that the cabin had been visited by at least 2 members of the Hale lineage around the time the ritual took place or before the cabin was burned. Even more striking was the female DNA trace found on the ascension seal. The protein residue on the metal surface was sufficient to reconstruct a partial DNA profile, though incomplete. But even that was enough to determine that this individual had no direct blood relation to the Hale family, yet still belonged to a group with indirect genealogical ties to several residents in the area who had been documented as participating in fringe belief groups. This genetic marker matched a subgroup that appeared in residency records during the 1980s, a subgroup in which 2 individuals had been noted in research documents as ritual assistants within a secretive sect. When cross-referenced with descriptions of ritual garments and roles in the ascension rite, particularly the role of priestess, the investigators concluded that this female DNA profile most likely belonged to the person who carried out the central part of the luminous path ritual. The presence of both male and female DNA, along with the Hale lineage, and a woman outside the family, reinforced the inference that the ritual required at least 3 to 4 participants, matching the description in the diary: 1 ritual leader, 2 light holders, and 1 path chooser. All these details were no longer scattered, but formed a consistent structure. When genealogy experts mapped the Hale family tree from the early 20th century through 1986, they discovered multiple separated branches moving back and forth between Kalamazoo, Van Buren, and Allegan counties. In particular, 3 collateral branches living close to the Milham Woods area had unstable residency histories. Many years without paying taxes, no recorded financial transactions, no public social activity. One of those branches included 3 individuals aged 30 to 40 in 1986, perfectly fitting for carrying out an organized ritual. The analysts ruled out those who died before 1986, those incarcerated, or those residing far away, gradually narrowing the list to 3 suspects who were alive in 1986 and still potentially active in the Michigan Wooded Hill region at the time of Elysia's disappearance. 3 names stood out prominently. Lucian Hale, a quiet man who once worked as a traveling carpenter and had a history of appearing near Jonas Hale's cabin. Marianne Fletcher, who had distant genealogical ties to the Hales, once lived in a small religious community and had medical records noting the use of herbs in rituals. Leonard Hale, a nephew of Jonas Hale, who had been reported near the Western Michigan University campus around the time Elysia vanished, based on a local resident's statement. When examining movement patterns more closely, Leonard emerged as the most prominent suspect. Employment records showed he had worked as a temporary security guard for a construction project near the WMU campus in exactly 1986. This placed Leonard within extremely close range of the route Elysia normally took. Furthermore, genealogical data from the hair sample showed genetic markers consistent with the direct paternal branch of Leonard's line. The other two suspects, Lucien and Marianne, had ritual connections, but lacked any biometric evidence placing them near Elysia's disappearance site. Therefore, when ranking levels of suspicion, Leonard became the focal point. From the cabin blood sample, a rare gene segment was found in a small sub-branch of the Hale family, the very sub-branch to which Leonard belonged. This was not complete identification evidence, but a strong genealogical indicator. While tracing Leonard's past, investigators discovered he had once lived near an old warehouse where some luminous path rituals had been documented in the late 1970s. There were records of him attending several autumn gatherings with Jonas Hale and a small group, though no criminal evidence existed at the time. A 1984 document described 2 men and 1 woman using the cabin at night with low red lighting, matching the ritual structure outlined in the diary. Combining all the facts, Leonard emerged as the individual with the highest likelihood of having played the role of light holder or path chooser in the ritual. When the investigative team pieced together the entire data into a diagram, Hale, genealogy, cabin, blood, fibers, diary, and Leonard's movements near campus, a new focal point formed. The investigators realized that not only Jonas Hale, but an entire branch of the Hale family had operated deeply within the luminous path structure, and this branch likely continued activities after the sect officially disbanded. The disbandment itself may have been only superficial, while core members carried on rituals at a more discreet level. Leonard Hale converged many elements: direct blood relation to Jonas Hale, DNA subgroup matching evidence in the cabin, presence near campus at the time of the incident, unusual residency history coinciding with the ritual time frame, appearance of genetic markers from his family branch in the hair sample. Based on genealogical connections and movement patterns, the investigative team placed Leonard Hale in the top suspect position for the ritual leading to Elysia's disappearance. Compared to the other 2 suspects, Leonard not only fit the DNA profile but also had behavioral and geographic patterns aligning with the perpetrator hiding in Millam Woods and operating within the luminous path group structure. DNA genealogy, which began with a seemingly meaningless strand of hair, had now opened a family tree map connecting the burned cabin, the Ascension Seal, Jonas Hale, the dispersed Hale family branches, and ultimately Leonard Hale, the person toward whom every genetic, behavioral, and geographic indicator pointed as the most crucial link in the Elysia case. The diary found in the cabin, and the additional notes recovered from the old crate in 2015, led the investigators to form a strong hypothesis that Jonas Hale was not only a participant in luminous path rituals, but also the ritual leader, the one who held decision-making authority and the ascension rite. But when the investigative team decoded deeper into the pages believed to have been written by Jonas himself, some loose sheets, some pasted over one another with long rotted glue, the picture became so clear that it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Jonas's handwriting was identified through sample characters from old invoices and job applications in 1978. Upon comparison, the examiners confirmed that the majority of the diary entries from the cabin were indeed written by Jonas. This not only gave the document significantly higher legal evidentiary value, but also paved the way for a clearer understanding of his motive, method, and role in the ritual connected to Elysia. In one page titled "The Vessel of Light," Jonas wrote about the chosen one with a mixture of reverence and obsession. She must carry natural light, undisturbed by everyday darkness. Slender frame, light step, heart in harmony. When compared to Elysia's profile, every detail aligned almost perfectly. She was of medium height, slender build, with a light and gentle walk that friends often described as soft. Her calm temperament, mild demeanor, and high focus made Elysia fit even more precisely with the criteria Jonas described for a bearer of light. The following pages showed that Jonas did not select victims randomly. One faded but legible passage read, "Observed through 7 solar cycles. Her light does not diminish." 7 solar cycles in the sex language meant 7 weeks. This made the investigative team startle. If Jonas was writing about Elysia, it meant he had been watching her for many weeks before the disappearance occurred. Prolonged surveillance fit the operating pattern of many extremist belief groups. They did not choose victims arbitrarily, but selected those believed to be in harmony with the signal of light. Another page stated more clearly, "The bearer of light manifests near the place of learning. She walks with the autumn wind, not shunning the darkness." Investigators were nearly certain that place of learning referred to the WMU campus, the symbolic language often used by belief groups. Autumn wind pointed to the autumn season, when Elysia vanished. These details not only proved Jonas had observed Elysia, but also accurately described her habits, regularly walking home through the Winchell area late in the evening. But something even more chilling appeared in the section where Jonas described the ritual process. A deeply indented passage in the middle of the diary was titled, "The Four Folds of Light." It listed the 4 essential roles required for the ascension rite to proceed. Ritual leader, guides, recites the revelations. Left light holder, maintains energy for the ritual. Right light holder, balances the transmission. Path chooser, leads the victim into the convergence point. The rough diagram Jonas drew matched the pattern inferred by forensics from the shoe prints. At least 2 people moving side by side and 1 following behind. This alignment led the investigators to affirm that the ritual required multiple perpetrators, not just one. It reinforced the hypothesis already raised by DNA genealogy. Lucian, Marianne, and Leonard could all have participated. An important passage in the diary was written in slanted script, as though Jonas were recording what he believed to be an intuition. The bearer of light is not always accepted. Some extinguish before the gate opens. Below that line was the sentence, "If the gate does not open, the ritual is ruined." Investigators asked, did extinguish mean the victim died before the ritual achieved their purpose? Based on the history of other extremist sects, this phrase often referred to a failed ritual, or one that did not produce the spiritual effect the group desired. And then came the sentence that silenced the investigation room. The previous ritual failed. Purification must be completed. This was the 3rd time information about a failed ritual appeared, once in the diary from the old crate, and once in research documents on Luminous Path. All 3 sources, though different, described the group having prepared a ritual where the victim may have escaped or the rite did not fulfill its intended purpose. This explained why Jonas and the remaining members had to seek a new bearer of light. The final sentence on the page made the investigators feel as though they were reading Jonas's absolute confession. If the bearer of light does not open the gate, the soul must be returned in ash. Ash, the word, appeared repeatedly in the cabin, where the soil contained blood traces and where the ascension seal was found. It also implied a concluding rite that could lead to the victim's death when the ritual failed. Jonas's writing that the soul must be returned in ash led the investigators to an unavoidable conclusion. According to the sect's beliefs, the victim was killed when the ritual failed. There was no alternative in their ideological logic. If the victim did not open the gate, the ritual viewed that as defilement requiring purification by fire and ash. The final pages of the diary also detailed the chosen location of the cabin. The reason for selecting Milham Woods, the forest still holds the old breath and descriptions of the low firelight used in the ritual. One short passage read, "She stepped into the night, unaware all paths had closed." This matched the information that Elysia was last seen talking to the hooded man. The entirety of Jonas's diary, when combined with DNA genealogy, red fibers, the ascension seal, the burned cabin, and Leonard's movements near campus, formed a unified conclusion. Elysia was killed when the ritual failed, a ritual that Jonas Hale planned, surveilled, and carried out together with the remaining members of Luminous Path. It was no longer a suspicion, no longer a hypothesis. Jonas Hale's diary carried the language of a man who absolutely believed in the ritual, and every line he wrote reconstructed Elysia's final moments, not as an abduction, but as a failed ritual leading to a death they considered necessary. The entries in Jonas Hale's diary not only described the ritual, but also included location symbols, small circles, diagonal slashes, representing convergence points, and 3 triangular marks scattered around the Milham Woods area. When those symbols were overlaid onto an old map found inside the burned cabin, the investigative team determined that Jonas had marked 3 suspicious plots of land, all located deep in the forest, between 200 and 600 meters from the cabin. The symbols did not align with commonly used trails. They deliberately pointed toward areas with little foot traffic, low-lying terrain, or thick canopy cover. This type of terrain was ideal for concealment or conducting rituals intentionally hidden from the outside world. To avoid disturbing the natural scene, the forensics team used ground-penetrating radar GPR to survey each location. The device emitted electromagnetic waves that scanned downward through soil layers and returned reflections of anomalies, voids, foreign objects, or structural changes in the ground. The first plot showed an unusual signal at a depth of about 80 centimeters, an abnormally compacted area with borders indicating previous digging. When the topsoil layer was carefully removed, a damp, rotten smell rose, and the technicians discovered fragments of decayed red fabric, identical in type to those recovered from the trail. Digging deeper, they found a small, very light, ivory-colored bone fragment. The medical examiner confirmed it was a human hand bone, specifically the third phalanx of the ring finger. Minutes later, as the soil was cleared aside, a small object glinted under the light. A technician gently picked it up, a delicate silver chain with a slightly deformed teardrop pendant. The investigative team immediately compared it to family photos provided in 1986. Alicia had worn an identical chain since she was 12 years old. This was no longer speculation. This evidence was precise enough to confirm Alicia had died. The medical examiners continued expanding the excavation to search for more. The lowest soil layer showed characteristics of mixed forest mud and fine ash, indicating the body had decomposed in an environment that had once experienced high heat. Some soil still contained charred protein traces matching those found in the burned cabin. This reinforced the hypothesis that luminous path rituals followed 2 stages: handling the victim, then burning or purifying at the cabin, followed by burial of the remains elsewhere. The second plot, about 400 meters south of the cabin, produced a stronger radar signal. Beneath the surface, technicians saw a blocky, irregular reflection pattern resembling a dug cavity containing a large object. At around 70 centimeters down, they uncovered several additional bone fragments, ribs, femur, and pieces of skull. Notably, the skull had a small groove at the temple, consistent with blunt force impact. Preliminary examination led forensics to conclude that these bones did not belong to Alicia, as the bone length and calcium density matched an older adult, most likely a female in her mid-20s to mid-30s. Combined with Jonas's diary entry about the previous ritual failed, the investigative team realized they might be standing over the remains of the victim from the failed ritual prior to 1986. The existence of 2 victims in separate locations not only supported the hypothesis that multiple rituals had taken place, but also confirmed that Luminous Path had repeatedly performed the ascension rite on a cyclical basis until the group disbanded or scattered. DNA extracted from the second set of bones matched a subgroup mentioned in 1980s research, a subgroup linked to a disappearance in 1981. This made the investigators nearly certain they had found the victim of the earlier failed ritual. The third plot, the deepest, right at the edge of marshland, produced a fainter radar signal. Excavation yielded mostly charred material, shortened wood fragments, scattered ash, and broken pottery shards, possibly ritual items. No human bones were found, but among the recovered objects was a small piece of reddish bronze metal bearing a symbol similar to the Ascension seal. This proved the third site had served as a ritual staging or transfer point, where the group placed items before or after the ceremony. When soil samples from all 3 sites were collected and compared to soil from the red fibers, the cabin, and the Milham Trail, forensics recorded high uniformity in soil composition, the same proportion of humus, manganese-rich mud, and charcoal residue. This proved the entire chain of events from the trail, to the cabin, to the burial sites occurred within the same forest area, following a consistent ritual process. Most critically, the decomposition timeline of the soil samples, root distribution patterns, and bone corrosion chemistry allowed estimation of the age of Alicia's remains. The results matched autumn of 1986, the time of her disappearance. There was no longer any doubt. Alicia had been murdered during the ritual phase, and her body had been disposed of exactly as Jonas described: fire, ash, and burial in Milham Woods. The three locations closed the picture that Jonas Hale's diary had described only halfway. The ascension rite had not only failed but had led to a series of deaths. With Alicia as the final victim chosen by the group, the discovery of her finger bone and chain not only confirmed her death, but also provided strong legal evidence to move the case out of cold case status. From that moment, the Alicia case was no longer a mystery of Milham Woods. It became a proven ritual murder case, backed by science, sufficient to proceed toward identifying the perpetrators and filing charges. Leonard Hale was no longer a vague name in the Hale family tree when the entire chain of evidence, diary entries, DNA genealogy, and movement data was pinned up on the investigation board. All the arrows, the overlapping layers of information from the hair sample, shoe prints, burned cabin, ritual map, to Jonas Hale's notes converged on a single point: Leonard. The genealogical analysis showed that the genetic markers found in the hair sample matched 98% with the paternal branch of Leonard, a level of match so close that it could virtually only occur if the hair came from a direct-line family member. But DNA was only half the story. The other half lay in the movement data Leonard left behind during the years he lived around the Kalamazoo area. Thanks to old employment records preserved on paper, the investigative team discovered that in 1986, Leonard had worked as a temporary security guard for a building repair project near the WMU campus. The job was short-term, but long enough for Leonard to be consistently present in the area Alicia passed through every evening. His shift schedule showed many assignments at dusk and nighttime, perfectly aligning with the route and timing when Alicia was last seen. When comparing the days Leonard was on campus with Jonas's diary, the investigators noted a chilling coincidence. 7 weeks before the disappearance date, Jonas wrote, "Observed through 7 solar cycles." And during exactly those 7 weeks, Leonard was the one present on campus according to his shift log. This made the hypothesis that Leonard was the path chooser, the person responsible for leading the victim into the wooded area, as described in the ritual, almost certain. To understand why Leonard had not been detected earlier, the investigators reviewed old files from interviews in the late 1980s. A sealed document from 1992 showed that police had once considered Leonard an indirectly related figure, but the file was quickly closed for lack of physical evidence. At that time, there was no DNA, no scene identification, and no legal basis to hold Leonard. He had no prior record, no one directly accused him, and there was no proof he had ever contacted Alicia. But the 1992 document revealed one important detail that had been overlooked back then. A witness who had seen the hooded man talking to Alicia described a build similar to the list of construction site security personnel. The description was not precise enough to charge anyone, but when compared to young Leonard's photos, the posture and relative height matched reasonably well. When the witness was re-interviewed in 1992, they no longer remembered clearly one reason Leonard was removed from the suspect list. Today, with all the new leads placed on the table, the reason he was cleared in the initial investigation became obvious. No technology, no DNA, no direct physical evidence, and no context about a ritualistic sect. No one back then could have imagined that the disappearance of a young student was tied to an extremist belief group. But 2024 is not 1986. When cross-referencing movement data, the investigative team uncovered another spine-chilling coincidence. On the very day Alicia vanished, Leonard was not present for his assigned shift, even though he was scheduled. The shift log recorded no reason for his absence. This placed him squarely in the direct line of suspicion. A security guard who stepped away from his shift on the exact night a female student disappeared on a route he knew well. When this information was connected to the hair sample containing his genetic markers, the investigators realized they were no longer dealing with a hypothesis. They had entered the realm of concrete evidence. The forensics lab continued analyzing the hair sample and detected traces of hair oil commonly used in the 1980s, a product popular only in a small subset of the population, including the area where Leonard had once lived. This did not prove guilt, but it strengthened the forensic picture. The hair could not have arrived at the location by chance. When focusing on Leonard, the investigators re-examined family information and discovered the deep connection between him and Jonas Hale. Though they did not live together, Leonard frequently visited Jonas's cabin on weekends. A blurry photograph from a 1979 file showing a group in front of Millam Woods included a young man standing next to Jonas who strongly resembled Leonard. Although it could not be verified 100%, facial analysis experts concluded a similarity level above 85%. In the context of ritual crime, this was a significant indicator of connection. Moreover, from Jonas's diary, the line, "The path chooser will lead her through the dark curtain," reminded the investigative team of the role Leonard once held. The person often stationed at the campus pathway area, the person who had the opportunity to observe Elysia from a distance. Jonas's diary also noted, "He saw her light before I did." Who was he? When considering the family tree, the most fitting person was Leonard, the younger relative who could approach the victim from farther away. From all this analysis, the investigative team reconstructed the suspect model. Jonas, ritual leader; Marian, priestess; Lucian, light holder; Leonard, path chooser, the one who lured or intercepted Elysia. But among these four, only Leonard remained alive, with sufficient movement data placing him at the scene. Marianne died in 2003. Jonas vanished in 1987 and was presumed dead. The cabin remains may have been his. Lucian disappeared after a blizzard in 1994. Leonard was the only one left to face legal accountability. When the entire data chain was laid out together, the hair sample matching 99.98%, matching movements, witness description of similar build, irregular shift paperwork, and deep connection to Jonas, the police decided to move forward. Apply for an arrest warrant. The warrant request clearly stated the suspicions. Leonard Hale participated in organized abduction. Leonard Hale participated in ritualistic murder according to a cult crime pattern. Leonard Hale directly or indirectly caused Elysia's death. The arrest warrant was prepared at high priority. The charges included first-degree murder, kidnapping, ritualistic crime, and evidence tampering. After nearly 4 decades, law enforcement finally stood at the threshold of prosecuting the man every forensic path led to, Leonard Hale. The arrest warrant was signed on a March morning in 2025, after the prosecutor received the full chain of forensic evidence. The Kalamazoo County SWAT team was mobilized because Leonard's file showed he had not only participated in extremist religious rituals, but also had the capacity to destroy evidence if he sensed he was being watched. The order was issued at 6:12 a.m. 4 unmarked armored vehicles rolled silently into the wooded residential area where Leonard had lived for more than 3 decades as a quiet, unassuming neighbor who never caused trouble. When the SWAT team leader observed through body cameras, he noticed something strange. In the backyard, Leonard was burning something in an old metal drum. Thick smoke rose, carrying the sharp, acrid smell of burning fabric into the air. Immediately, the assault team switched to a rapid entry plan. The back door was breached in under 4 seconds. Leonard turned around, eyes wide but not panicked, a reaction many officers later admitted they had not expected. He raised both hands but still positioned himself in front of the burning pile of ash, as though trying to shield whatever he had just thrown into the fire. As he was taken into custody, technicians quickly extinguished the flames and recovered intact ash samples. Among them, police found fragments of red fabric, a piece of hand-braided cord, and a small carved wooden fragment bearing the exact symbol found in the burned cabin. In the interrogation room, Leonard maintained an eerily calm expression. When read his Miranda rights, he merely nodded once. The investigators began with the DNA evidence, the hair sample matching 99.98%, and traces from the cabin. Leonard sighed, placed both hands on the table, and said a single sentence that silenced the room. "I was present at the ritual, but I did not lead it. Everything was Jonas's doing." That blunt admission was both a turning point and a calculated move. Leonard did not deny involvement. Instead, he confirmed his role while immediately shifting all responsibility onto Jonas Hale, whom police believed had died in the late 1980s. This raised a major question. Was Leonard trying to save himself, or protect someone else. When asked when Jonas died, Leonard only replied, "I didn't witness it with my own eyes. He disappeared." But his ritual never truly ended. That statement unsettled the investigators in a way they could not describe. For months they had operated under the assumption that Luminous Path had disbanded and only remnants remained. But Leonard was implying the opposite. The sect was still alive. And Jonas may not have been the only one giving orders or running the rituals. Throughout the interrogation, Leonard remained evasive, sometimes claiming he was merely an assistant, other times saying none of us had the right to refuse. He used the word we repeatedly, an inclusive plural, that widened the scope of suspects beyond what police had known. When pressed to name the others, Leonard stayed silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "The fourth one gave the orders. Not Jonas." This sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The entire ritual structure outlined in Jonas's diary described only 4 roles: the ritual leader, Jonas, 2 light holders, and the path chooser. So, who was this fourth one who gave orders? Had Jonas not been the true head, but merely one link? Leonard refused to reveal the identity, but when asked to surrender any remaining documents, he quietly nodded. Police recovered a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a wooden compartment under the floorboards. Among them were previously unseen diary pages. Handwriting different from Jonas's, harder, straighter, more like the style of someone directing rather than recording. One page contained a line that stunned the entire team. "The failed rite of 1981 must be replaced. The next bearer of light has appeared." The following line was signed with a symbol of 3 diagonal slashes, a mark that did not match any known handwriting sample from Jonas Hale. This proved what Leonard had implied. There was a true superior figure, possibly the fourth one Jonas's diary never directly mentioned. When the information spread beyond the interrogation room, Kalamazoo fell into chaos. Leonard Hale had been the neighbor who watered plants, attended neighborhood meetings, contributed to community funds, the man everyone saw as the quiet but harmless uncle. He lived quietly, cared for an old dog, and often brought homemade cookies to the family next door at Christmas. Nothing in his outward behavior suggested involvement in a brutal ritual murder. News of the arrest spread rapidly. Local broadcasts ran bold headlines: "Man living 40 years in the neighborhood charged in 1986 ritual murder." Neighbors gathered outside Leonard's house, some in tears, some in fury. No one could believe the man who swept leaves every morning in the neighborhood was connected to the mysterious disappearance that had haunted the city for 4 decades. One woman told reporters on camera, "He gave candy to the kids every Halloween. I can't believe this was the real him." Outside police headquarters, Alicia's family stood in silence. Her mother trembled when she heard Leonard had admitted being present at the ritual. Her father clenched his fists, eyes red. "We've waited 39 years for this day." Meanwhile, what disturbed the community most was not Leonard's arrest, but the implication that the sect had never truly vanished. The fact that Leonard was burning ritual items in his backyard proved he knew police were closing in, or someone had warned him. This only heightened suspicion that remnants of Luminous Path were still active somewhere in Michigan. The investigators now faced 2 terrifying realities at once. Leonard had been present at the ritual that killed Alicia. He was not the leader. And now, when he spoke of the fourth one, a new threat emerged, a shadow never seen throughout the entire investigation. But the physical evidence had reached the legal threshold. Matching DNA, burned items, new diary pages, indirect admissions. All of it was sufficient to bring Leonard to trial. In a peaceful city like Kalamazoo, where people lock doors with their left hand and wave from porches, the realization that a man tied to a murderous cult had lived among them for nearly half a century created profound shock, not just because of the crime, but because he had hidden so well for so long. Right inside a community that still believed the darkness of the 1980s had long since ended. The arrest of Leonard Hale was not the end of the case. On the contrary, it was the moment the city realized a terrifying truth. There is still someone else out there, the fourth one, the one who gave the orders in the ritual that took Alicia's life. The trial of Michigan versus Leonard Hale opened in an atmosphere thick with tension, as the entire Kalamazoo community fixed its gaze on a courtroom that had seen many cases over decades, but had never confronted a crime so ancient and so coldly ritualistic. The prosecutor stepped forward, carrying not just a case file but a timeline stretching from 1986 to 2025, a chain of physical evidence, forensic data, ritual maps, sect diaries, and DNA genealogy recovered through layers of time's dust. All of it aimed to prove that Leonard Hale had not merely been present on the night Elysia disappeared, but had directly participated in Luminous Path's ritual murder, a ritual that Jonas Hale himself had described as the gate of purification that must be opened by the light of the chosen one. The prosecutor spoke in a firm, unwavering voice, beginning at the start of the story. The early autumn evening in 1986, when Elysia was last seen speaking to a hooded man whose build matched Leonard's. The bicycle placed unnaturally neatly, the red fabric with ritual weave structure, the rare star-patterned shoe print, the trail leading straight into Milham Woods, the burned cabin where blood from at least 2 people and carved symbols were found beneath charred wood, the Ascension seal, the ritual metal piece bearing ancient fingerprints dated to 1986, the hair sample once misfiled, but in 2024 confirmed to match Leonard's DNA at 99.98%. Jonas Hale's diary describing 4 ritual roles and confirming weeks of surveillance on Elysia. The second diary Leonard surrendered, containing the line. The fourth one gave the orders, revealing a previously unknown sect hierarchy. And finally, Elysia's remains discovered at one of the 3 ritual plots Jonas had marked on the cabin map. Each piece of evidence was laid before the jury like the final pieces of a crime mosaic, and with every item the prosecutor presented, the courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence, as though the air itself were being strangled. When the prosecutor displayed the forensic simulation of the Ascension rite, how Elysia was led into the woods, how 4 people surrounded her, how the cabin served as the ritual center, the gallery stared at the screen as though witnessing a reenactment of a ceremony. Elysia's mother broke into sobs when her daughter's scorched chain was brought before the jury, and her father gripped his hands so tightly his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor outlined each role: Jonas as the ritual leader, Marianne as the priestess, Lucian as a light holder, and Leonard, the man now standing at the defendant's table as the path chooser, the one responsible for approaching the victim, observing her, and guiding her to the ritual convergence point. According to the 1986 shift log, Leonard was absent from his assigned duty on the exact night Elysia vanished. The hair sample carrying his DNA was found right at the forest entrance. The shoe print matched his foot size. Jonas's diary stated, "He saw her light before I did," a phrase forensic linguistics identified as referring to the person positioned closest to the victim, and Leonard himself was arrested in 2025 while burning ritual items in his backyard, an act regarded as intentional evidence destruction. All of it combined led the prosecutor to charge 4 of the most serious offenses under Michigan law: kidnapping, first-degree murder, occult homicide, and conspiracy to commit ritual killing. Leonard's defense, presented through his attorney, was extremely weak: that he had only participated under spiritual coercion, that Jonas was the true leader of the ritual, that he had not directly harmed anyone. But that argument collapsed completely when the prosecutor displayed a large 3-dimensional DNA chart. The hair sample matched Leonard exactly. Cabin proteins carried gene sequences from his family branch. Fingerprints on the Ascension seal showed ridge patterns consistent with Leonard's youthful prints, and his proximity to campus aligned with the witness description from decades earlier. The prosecutor asked, why would an innocent man have his DNA at both the entry to the forest, the ritual site, and on a ritual object used exclusively in the light offering? Leonard bowed his head and gave no answer. When asked why he burned ritual items on the very morning of his arrest, Leonard replied, "I didn't want them to fall into anyone else's hands." That statement sent a shiver through the entire courtroom, because it implied he still viewed the ritual not as past history but as something with continuing value. The jury took 47 minutes to reach a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge read the sentence amid the courtroom's held breath. Leonard Hale is sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for first-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit ritual killing, and participation in an extremist religious ritual resulting in the death of Alicia. As he was led away, Leonard turned to look at Alicia's family not with remorse, but with an expression that seemed to say he was merely a small piece in something much larger. That look chilled the community to the bone, especially after Leonard's surrendered diary repeated the reference to the fourth one. Yet this trial marked a landmark legal turning point in Michigan. The first time modern forensics, DNA genealogy, family tree analysis, and sect diaries were fully recognized as a valid evidentiary chain in a ritual murder case. Kalamazoo finally heard the verdict. It had waited 4 decades, for though it could not bring Alicia back, it returned to her family and to the city a portion of the truth that had lain buried in the shadows of Millam Woods for 39 years. But even as the sentence was pronounced, one question hung heavier than ever. If Leonard was not the one giving the orders, then where, in the darkness of Michigan, does the fourth one stand? The Alicia case file was officially closed in October of 2025, nearly 4 decades after the night she vanished in the Winchell area. But that closure did not bring a sense of completion. It felt more like a door locked from the outside, while inside, dark rooms remained unexplored. Alicia's family signed the final document with trembling hands. Her father quietly said he had waited for this moment half his life, while her mother simply wept without words. In the conclusion report, police stated clearly, "Victim deceased, in the context of ritualistic homicide. Perpetrator Leonard Hale, sentenced to life without parole. Other identified suspects, Jonas Hale, Lucian Hale, and Marianne Fletcher, all deceased or long missing." But right below that line, a red stamped note suggested a far more persistent truth. Open subsidiary investigation. Unidentified subject, the fourth one. Even though the trial had ended, police understood that the Alicia case did not truly conclude with Leonard, because he himself, right in the interrogation room, had revealed that he was not the one giving orders, that within the ritual structure there remained a higher figure, the coordinator, overseer, and final arbiter. Jonas's diary had hinted at the same thing through vague phrases. "He saw her light before I did. The order did not come from me." And finally, in the notebook Leonard surrendered, the line, "The fourth one gave the orders," appeared like a blade slicing through the fragile calm. Therefore, immediately after Leonard's sentencing, police quietly opened a new, small-scale, but secret investigative branch involving specialists in extremist religious behavior and ritual crime. They did not disclose this to the press to avoid stirring panic, but internal records stated plainly, real possibility exists of a still-living covert operative. The subsidiary branch reviewed residency records of individuals once connected to Jonas Hale, those who changed names, addresses, or vanished from civil documentation between 1982 and 1988. The findings caused deep concern. 3 individuals once part of a Luminous Path splinter branch had never been confirmed deceased. One had lived within 30 miles of Milham Woods, another had been present in the Van Buren area during the autumn of 1986, and the last had been mentioned in a scattered cult activity report from the 1970s. Criminologists who joined the first secret meeting right after the trial assessed that Luminous Path may never have truly disbanded as historical documents claimed. Instead, they likely fragmented into small, low-profile cells that continued rituals discreetly, while still adhering to the core philosophy of light, purification, and ascension rite. One expert said, "A sect disappearing from the newspapers does not mean it disappeared from the woods." That sentence was recorded verbatim in the meeting minutes. In parallel, forensics continued excavating 2 additional plots in the Milham Woods area after Alicia's remains and the 1981 victim were found. But instead of closure, the discoveries raised fresh alarm. Another fragment of red fabric with a different weave pattern than previously recovered. Ash traces with chemical structure similar to cabin evidence but located at a site not marked on the ritual map, and an unidentifiable bone fragment too heavily degraded to determine sex. Analysts believed these could be traces of unrecorded rituals, raising the possibility of additional unreported or never missing persons victims. A veteran officer said during the meeting, "If a sect operating 30 years ago had a systematic victim selection process, the chance they only had 2 victims is extremely low." Once partial internal information leaked, Kalamazoo residents began to fear there might still be undiscovered bones in the forest they had picnicked in for generations. People living near Milham reported occasionally seeing faint low lantern light in the night, but previously no one took it seriously. Now everything had changed. And then, on a late autumn morning when the Elysia case had just been officially declared closed, when the press ran continuous stories about the community finally receiving answers, when her family tried to begin the healing process after 39 years of waiting, an unmarked envelope was placed in the mailbox outside Kalamazoo Police Department headquarters. No one saw who dropped it. There were no fingerprints, no camera footage. Inside the envelope was only a single old sheet of paper, edges yellowed with age, bearing handwriting slanted exactly like the script in previously undiscovered diary pages. Ascension was interrupted. Another light must rise. That single line instantly shifted every meeting from monitoring to emergency status. It showed not only that the writer was still alive, but that they were actively following the investigation, knew Leonard had been arrested, knew the ritual had been exposed, and most importantly, they believed the ritual was not finished. No one in the department dared say anymore that the Elysia case had truly ended. The investigators understood that Leonard was only one corner of the iceberg, that Jonas was merely the practitioner and not the head, that Marianne and Lucian were merely instruments in the ritual, and that the fourth one, the true commander, remained out there, moving through Michigan like a formless shadow, a cold witness to an era of cult activity that had never truly disappeared. The Elysia case closed on paper, but in Milham Woods, in the ash remnants, in the old carved symbols, and in the anonymous letter delivered to police headquarters, one truth rang clearer than any verdict: the darkness has not ended. The fourth one is still alive. And he has never stopped. The story of Elysia and the Luminous Path case is not just a tragedy spanning 4 decades. It reflects a very American truth that even in the most peaceful communities like Kalamazoo, Winchell, or any middle-class suburb, darkness can exist for a very long time without anyone noticing. The case shows that crime does not always appear in the form of overt violence. Sometimes it hides inside people who seem completely harmless, like Leonard Hale, who lived among the community for nearly 40 years, attended neighborhood meetings, baked cookies for neighbors, yet carried in his past a ritual murder. This is an important lesson for American society today. Safety does not come only from locking doors or installing cameras, but from a community that truly watches out for one another and notices even the smallest signs of abnormality. The story also reminds us of the value of modern forensic science. Evidence once considered useless. In 1986, the hair sample, cabin ash, red fabric fragments only became the key to solving the case in 2024. This shows that the United States must continue investing in forensics, DNA storage, and especially retest cold cases programs to ensure past mistakes are not repeated. Finally, the most important lesson comes from Elysia herself. She was the victim of an extremist group that believed in secret rituals no one in society at the time recognized the signs of. America today still faces many new forms of extremism, religious, political, or deviant belief systems. The story warns that groups like Luminous Path can exist right in the most seemingly peaceful suburbs. So the lesson is not just stay vigilant, it is to build a community that listens, that reports anything unusual, that uses science and law to protect the most vulnerable, so that no second Elysia vanishes in silence. If you want to continue the journey of uncovering cases long thought forgotten but still quietly reminding us of the need for vigilance and the power of justice, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the Elysia case. See you in the next video, where we continue shining light into the hidden corners beneath the calm surface of America.